What's up, everybody? Jeff here, and I'm super excited because I'm sitting down with Dave McGuire, who used to be a writer for Weird Miniatures. How you doing, Dave?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for joining me here. I'm super excited to talk to you about some Malifaux stuff. Just to kind of give everybody an idea of who we're really dealing with here. Do you want to give us a quick rundown of the some of the stories that you wrote for Weird?
Yeah, sure. I wrote mostly stories in the first edition and some in the second edition as well, and wrote quite a few stories in the Rising Powers book. So it was all of the faction stories in that, stories like Puzzle Box and A Great Adventure, and then I wrote other stories. Oh, so let me see. Do you want me to give you a list of what I wrote? Is
Oh, I
that?
have a list here. I really just wanted to I wanted to give everybody an idea because you wrote Puzzle Box, which introduced Damien Ravencroft, who recently became a master. You wrote The Mountain Straight Reply, which introduced English Ivan, who became a master, I guess probably 2 years ago now. You also wrote Master of Fate, which is a story where we get our first real background and kind of characterization of Zoraida, which was huge. You also wrote The Final Word, which introduced the Library of All Things, which just kind of a new master came out of that story. So some of the real heavy hitting stories, some of the most popular, certainly when there was a lot of speculation going on recently about where new masters might come from and what stories they might come from, a lot of those stories came up in the conversation. And it turns out that you wrote a whole bunch of them. So pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that was very flattered to see that that they'd gone back to those old stories. I haven't thought of them for quite a while, and so it was really surprised to get emails from a couple of people saying, have you seen this? Have you seen that from Weird? And sort of click on the link and follow it and say, hang on a minute, I know them. So yeah, really fantastic to see Weird doing that.
Yeah, very cool. They seem to enjoy your writing just as much as the fans do. Before we kind of jump in a little bit deeper into some of those stories, though, can you give me a little bit of background of sort of what you were doing before you wrote for them and how you got involved with Weird?
Yeah, sure. So what I was doing before, working, lots and lots of working, and doing a bit of writing on the side, and started doing fan fiction for actually 40k. So just enjoying doing fan fiction for that, writing that in the forums, sharing stories, chatting with other people about their stories, all that sort of thing. And then got into Malifaux 2009, 2010, started playing it, and just sort of transferred the writing. I thought, oh, I could write some Malifaux stories as well. Saw Weird had a forum, had been chatting on that, so I wrote a story, stuck that up on the forum. It's probably still there. And a couple of weeks later, I got an email from Weird saying, read your story. Give me a holler if you want to have a chat about writing for us. So I did, and that's how it all began.
Wow, very cool. This is the first I'm hearing of it. I am definitely gonna go see if I can track that down. Do you remember what it was about or who was in it?
The story was called Treasure, and it was a story about a miner, soulstone miner, who comes across a very significant find in the mines and tries to come up with an elaborate way of sneaking it out of the mine without getting caught.
Okay, that sounds very on brand for you. Kind of complicated, interesting intrigue, all kinds of stuff like that. I'm gonna have to go pull that
And a
out.
little bit gruesome as well, yes.
And a little gruesome, of course, yeah. Wow, that's interesting. I didn't know you were doing fan fiction and then Weird just pulled you out. That's pretty cool. So what did that
Yeah,
process
yeah, it was just writing for fun, yeah.
Yeah, very cool. So what did that process look like? They reached out to you and then I guess you told them you were interested and how did it proceed from there?
Yeah, we just had a sort of back and forth chat, sort of getting to know each other over the email, and give them some other writing examples that I'd done, original fiction, because at that time I was writing short stories as well that weren't fan fiction, original pieces, trying to see about getting them published here and there with some very minor successes. Pretty poor when you look back on it, but you got to try. And they like that, so we had a chat about, could you write a story for this? We've got, this next book coming out. Could you maybe do something for Colette or some of the other characters? So we just had chats about, what characters there were, what story opportunities there were, where they saw the story going. And then it was just a case of batting story ideas back and forth and saying, right, this is what I think the story could look like. You would have a chat about it, flesh it out if they like it, and then say, right, okay, they say go ahead and write that, do 5,000 words or whatever, and give me a deadline, which I would ignore entirely. And and as the deadline approached, I would start writing the thing.
That sounds about right. So
yeah, writing is impossible without a deadline. I can't do it.
Yeah, for sure. It's I feel like any creative thing, it's gotta keep yourself disciplined somehow, but it doesn't always work. So how much? It sounds like it was a pretty organic process where you guys kind of started discussing the types of characters and the types of stories and kind of worked on it together. How much oversight did they have, or how much guidance did they give you about where to take those stories? Was it pretty much like write a story about Colette? You kind of came up with your idea and they said okay, or did they give you any more kind of input than that?
No, they were pretty free with the ability to come up with the ideas. So, as I recall, with the Colette story, the idea was just write a story about Colette, and I thought, fine, I'll just come up with something. I think at the time I'd been watching Ricky Jay videos on YouTube. Do you know who Ricky Jay is?
No, I don't.
He's or he was. I may be wrong about that, but anyway, a wonderful close-up card magician.
Okay.
And storyteller, and if ever there was a con man, it was Ricky Jay. He was just looked the part, sounded the part, acted the part. Fantastic card player and trickster. And he would do these sort of elaborate card tricks, always with a story behind them. And I thought, right, okay, Colette, Ricky Jay, I've got to do something there. So that was the idea. So I pitched them on the idea of a story as a card trick. Which of course kind of fits in with Malifaux. You've got the guy. It's probably the first thing every writer thinks of when they come to Malifaux is, oh, I bet I can do something clever with cards. So
For sure.
I had the exact same thought, and then just sort of gave them the idea. They said, fine, go ahead and go with it. And then I think there was a story as well about the Dreamer. Yes, that's right. And completely blanked on the name of, yes, Death Marshals.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, it was just an idea of, can you do a story with the Dreamer, and discussed putting in some Death Marshals hunting something in the Badlands, and then just came up with a story from there. So
Cool. Yeah, just so everybody knows, the Colette story is just called Arcanists from, I think it's the second book, and it's the one where Colette gets in the carriage with the mechanical horses and then almost gets killed, and a whole bunch of shenanigans ensue. And then the one
that's
with
the
the
one.
Death Marshals, I forget the name of that one off the top of my head, but I'll put it up on the video so folks have it.
Yeah, so I think at that time they weren't crediting writers in the books.
No, they were not.
And they didn't have that many writers. So after that book came out, we had a discussion about that and agreed, yep, we'll credit all the writers. And I got final edit on the stories as well after that point.
Very cool. So for the stories that you've written that focus more on main characters, I'm thinking of like The Final Word, which kind of introduces the 10 Thunders. You also did Deadline, which was a big story about Molly, who was a main character at the time. Did they have any more input as to where they wanted those stories to go because of they were kind of more important characters, or was it still the same process where you just kind of pitched a story and they said yes or no?
Again, yeah, it was mostly just pitching the story. So there'd be sort of various email chains with the writers on them, and we'd sort of throw around story ideas on that. But the steer was generally sort of the hand was very light, if I can put it that way, in an editorial sense. And so each writer would be asked to write a story, about a character, or just asked which characters do you want to write stories about? Give us some ideas. I think the things they weren't keen on was, anything significantly major story related. And they didn't like origin stories either. I think they wanted to avoid those concepts. So we were tend to always be just hitting the characters, in media res, sort of in the middle of their actions. I think that's where Master of Fate. I think there was a concern that felt like it might be a Zoraida origin story.
Yeah.
But they said yes. So
Okay, very cool. I guess they liked it enough to make an exception, so that's cool.
yeah, I hope so. But no, they never. I don't recall them ever shooting down any particular story ideas. There was some flavour that they would say no to. So if you were referencing or using phrases from history, an example is Geronimo. I put that in a story and it got edited out. They said, oh, no, it's we don't want to use that. Okay. So they wanted to avoid anything overtly historical that might in the future be something that they wish they hadn't referenced.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff like that where you don't want to write yourself into a corner where you have to honor those things in the future.
Mhm.
What was there? I guess more generally speaking, was there any kind of style guide or guidance given on like how to write the stories, or was that also just kind of up to you and they said yes or no?
No, there was no style guide. There was the existing background, and so you just had to familiarise yourself with that. Because remember, the first book had the sort of main overarching story
Mhm.
of Victoria coming to Malifaux, which set all the groundwork essentially.
Sure.
And yeah, as long as you didn't contravene or contradict any of that, rather, then I think they were happy with it. If they liked the direction the story was going in, you just get an email from Nathan or whoever at Weird saying, yeah, go ahead with that, sounds good, let us know when you're done.
Okay, very cool.
So it was good having that sort of creative freedom to look at the background, to pick and choose a bit, but also say, right, okay, this is what I feel the setting is, this is what I feel it's drawing on. And to be honest, Malifaux draws on a bit of everything, doesn't it? So
Mm.
if you think, well, I like my cowboys, or I like my steampunk, or I like my steampunk cowboys, you can find room for just about anything.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder if any of that's changed now that the lore has gotten so much bigger and more expansive. Because at the time you started writing for them, it was just the first book that was out and some weird chronicles, I guess. So there wasn't as much that you would have to know. Whereas now there's a lot more different kind of plots going on. So I wonder if that's changed.
I'm fairly sure it has, yeah. As you say, there's now so many books built up, so much dense background material as well. Yeah, I equally I wonder if there is now a style guide or at least something that is circulated amongst writers to keep an eye on it. I really ought to reach out to a couple of them and ask.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, so getting into some of the specifically some of the stuff that you wrote, I'm sure folks have noticed based on the list of stories you're responsible for, but you have uh, your stories tend to be pretty complicated, and I don't not necessarily in a bad way. What I mean is that there's a lot of kind of detail and suggestions of kind of larger stories that go into it, as well as the plots themselves being fairly complex with a lot of different moving parts. Masters of Fate, I think, is a great example. There's a million different things going on. You don't really understand what's happening until the very end. Um, how do those stories come together for you? Like, what's the process for writing a story that's that complicated? Because one of the important things is, these are pretty short stories. They're 5 to 10, maybe 12 pages on the high end. So, what's the process like for putting that all together and kind of keeping it reined in enough to fit in that small page count?
I'm not sure I've always succeeded at keeping it reined in, to be honest. Some of the ideas are maybe more complicated than the word length would allow. But yeah, some of them could have perhaps been simplified a little bit or made a bit longer. But that's always been one of my issues as a writer, is I've tried to cram too much in. Um, I suppose the main starting point is the idea. So with, for example, just to take Master of Fate as an example, I knew I wanted to do a story with the three main Neverborn masters in guild headquarters,
Hmm.
and I knew what I wanted to get to in terms of the ending. And I don't have a story unless I know what the end is.
Hmm.
So once I have the ending, once I know, right, it has to be, and do we throw a spoiler warning on here?
Yeah, I'll put one up at the beginning. If you're coming into the video, you should know that these things are getting spoiled.
Okay,
But yeah, I'll
okay.
put up a warning. I appreciate that.
So yeah, once you know that your end is why Zoraida did all this,
Mhm.
why Zoraida has gone to this, these ridiculous lengths and ended up with Lilith and Pandora fighting against her at the end of the story to make her do the thing that she had put herself there to do. Once you've got that core ending in mind, then I sort of rewind back and think, right, how did they get there? What's a fun way of getting them to that point? And then throwing them sort of in and out of different bodies just seemed like a really fun idea. And I thought, right, okay, I can have some fun with that. And so yeah, I don't structure them. I don't write outlines. They tend to just sort of form in my head a rough idea, and I think, right, okay, I will probably have 3 beats to this story and then the ending. So if I start writing, I know I'm writing 6,000 words, so probably my first beat needs to be about introduction of 500 words, and then first beat maybe another 1,000, 1,500. So I know roughly how long that first beat's got to be, and then that sort of helps pace the story as well. So I'm planning it as I go, and I'll be writing it and I'll think of the next fun thing to do, and I'll be thinking of, all right, I now know what beat 2 is, and that tells me what beat 3 is. That's great, right? I know roughly where I'm going now, and I've only just started writing it. And then, you're, before you know it, you're 3,000 words in and sailing along, and then you go back and look at the beginning and realize, right, that's absolute rubbish. That's got to go. And you have to take out the first 500 words you've written, but that always happens.
Yeah, actually, my next question was going to be is, if you start with the resolution or the end of the story and then kind of extrapolate backwards, there's a risk that it doesn't feel organic. It feels contrived at the end because you just kind of, you already knew where the ending was going to go and then you just kind of fill in the rest. So how do you make sure that it kind of stays cohesive and makes sense as you kind of backfill the story?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And it's definitely a risk. And that's why I think when I'm trying to pin down what the ending is, you don't know that until you know who the characters are. Because if the ending makes sense for the character, and it makes sense in character terms, then that will work. As long as you do the groundwork to get there and you don't break the character on the way there.
Hmm.
So in that sense, with Master of Fate, you know that the character of Zoraida is that she will achieve her aims. She won't let anything get in her way. And the twist is, even if it's herself,
Hmm.
so that works for her as a character. So you know that the ending is going to work, and you know that Pandora and Lilith would behave the way you need them to behave at that point. And so you're just trying to get there in a fun way. You're trying to plant mysteries as you go so that the reader's intrigued what's happening here. I'm enjoying seeing these 3 characters interact. They're doing some fun things, and then hopefully the ending comes and it both surprises and feels inevitable, I suppose is the best way to put it.
Yeah, and it's clearly a difficult thing to do to make it feel natural because there's plenty of people making high budget Hollywood movies that do a terrible job of that. Um, so that seems like a very tricky thing to keep a handle on. But I think you do an excellent job of it because those are again some of the best stories that they've put out. So
Thanks very much. Bit
uh,
as well. So yeah, I've never tried writing a novel, so it's a very different kettle of fish.
yeah, maybe the length is a blessing and a curse in that sense.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's about the structure of the plot of the stories. And again, I think again, Mountain Straight Reply is another great example of very complicated, a lot of different moving parts, many things going on, don't really know what's happening till the end. The Final Word, again, kind of a mystery where you see all these different hints and clues as you go, and we don't get a real payoff till the end. But I think particularly Deadline and also Master of Fate, we see two characters that already existed who we didn't ever really get much in terms of characterization for. Molly was kind of just the thing that carried around Philip's head and kind of bounced off of Seamus. Zoraida was the swamp hag cliche and didn't really have much more to her. And both of those stories are the first time that we really get some serious characterization for those characters, and we get a little bit of an origin story and some background, but we also learn more about them as people. So, what's that process like? Especially, you've written original characters as well, but it seems like even more of a challenge to take a character who has like a very rough outline of a personality, and now you're taking them and giving them a much more developed character.
I suppose in those cases, what I was starting with was, as you say, just sort of a rough outline, a rough sketch of a character. And in the case of Zoraida, basically an archetype from myth and legend.
Yeah.
I suppose what you can do there is just say, well, okay, I've got a very rough sketch, but what would this person actually be like? And I think that was where I started from with Molly. Because I thought, well, she hadn't been given much character. She'd featured quite a bit in the core story, but not really as a character, just as someone who was there,
yeah,
and to whom things happened. And I felt like she was that female character to whom things happened, and I thought I really want to bring her front and center. I want to give her her own motivations, her own reasons for doing things that aren't anything to do with Seamus, effectively, and for her to, over the course of the story, become her own person, both during the story and hopefully in the mind of the reader. So I was very focused on, right, okay, who was she as a character, and how can I bring that out? So I think once you've done that groundwork, again, that suggested the story. Said, well, okay, Molly used to be a reporter. Now she's dead. Why should that stop her? At that point, the story almost writes itself.
Yeah, for sure. And that's kind of the first, aside from when we first see her and she's still alive. That's really the first time we get. That's the first time her history really matters to the story at all, where she was a reporter, and we kind of get a little bit of insight in what she was doing prior to her being dead. Um, and then I guess Zoraida, similar thing, right? She was just the swamp hag, and then we learn not only about her kind of origin, but a little bit more about her motivation, and like you said before, the fact that she's kind of willing to do anything that needs to be done to accomplish her goals. Anything else go into that? She, to me, Zoraida seems like one of those characters that it's very clear that in universe she's one of the most important characters, because she's so powerful and she's so kind of has her finger in every different thing going on in Malifaux. But we really don't actually see much of that. It's really more suggested, with the exception of Masters of Fate. So I guess you may not have known that at the time of writing, but what was it like to write to kind of develop her out?
Yeah, that was a slightly different process for Zoraida, and I suppose one of the shorthands for doing an effective story with a character is to hurt them effectively, to make them go through pain, and see how they react to it. That is always a very character-defining moment, when someone goes through a crisis that is physically, emotionally, spiritually painful in some way, and seeing how they deal with it. And it's only, I suppose, at the end of the story you realise that's what's happening, that she's put herself in that situation, knows how she'll deal with it, and is trying to have that resolve in an acceptable way, despite the fact she knows it's going to hurt her. So I think that is a very good way of revealing character in any story.
Yeah, awesome. And then to kind of contrast both of them, you wrote the original story to introduce us to English Ivan and Damien Ravencroft. How is that different when you kind of have your own thing and can develop a character from the ground?
Yeah, how do you come at that character? There's, I suppose, a lot of sources of inspiration. So thinking back to English Ivan, he started with a name. It was just a name. I can't remember where I got the name from, to be honest. And then I knew I wanted a sort of steampunk character. And I think I had read about the Department of Ungentlemanly Affairs, which was a sort of World War II or pre-World War II British institution. And I thought that sounded like a fun thing to slot into Malifaux. So the character of Ivan, to some extent, I'll be honest, he is a slightly funny hat character, which is where you take a character and put a funny hat on him and hope that gives him a personality. And I think some of it did come through as I wrote it. His character started to come out, but to some extent, he started off in my head as just being a costume and a name and a series of personality tics, and then developed from there. Whether that was successful or not, I'll leave up to others to judge.
I think you actually, if it's been a couple months since I read the story, but I've read it enough times that I'm pretty familiar with it. I feel like you almost see that transition through the story, because at the beginning he's kind of just like one-liners and interacting with other people, but you don't really get much of his personality except for that he doesn't like cursing.
Mhm.
And then later, once he actually gets in the thick of it and the drama starts happening, I feel like that's when you actually start to see his personality come out.
Yeah, and it's probably a reflection of the writing process where I'm starting to get comfortable with him, starting to get to know what he's like. And, up against a reasonable deadline, I would probably have gone back and rewritten some earlier parts of
I think
English Raven,
actually,
or possibly entirely rewritten his introduction, but you don't always have the time or the nation to do it.
I was gonna say, I think it actually adds to the effect because it makes him feel more mysterious, right? He's this kind of secret agent that we don't really know who his real allegiance is, and we have all these different suggestions of what might be going on, and there's things going on in other places. And then once we start to put the pieces together as the reader, that's when we start to see more of his personality. I actually think it adds to it. It works well.
Oh, good. That story was more a plot. That was more a process story. That one of having something cool happen, having a sort of twisty heist plot. So you look at the Molly story, and that was working out who the character was and then what the story would be from that. Whereas Mountain Straight reply was, "I just want a cool steampunk heist. How can we do that?" And then there's, you get I suppose, the equivalent of movie heist flashbacks, which are these other scenes happening elsewhere. And that was fun as well, because that just lets you just have wee snapshots of bits of the background, other parts of Malifaux, a wee snippet of colour here and there.
Yeah, we get to see what Lucius is up to, and we learn a little bit more about how the air car system works and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, very good.
Yes.
And then Damien, the newest star of the story here, he, I guess, would is an even more interesting challenge because he didn't have a personality. He kind of, as written, wasn't supposed to not have a personality because he was kind of magically
Mhm.
lobotomized. So what was that like, trying to put that together?
That that was more of a challenge. Um, but I think he's my favourite of the created characters that I've come up with. Um, and hopefully it comes out in the story, but he is written at the beginning as a complete automaton. And then as the story progresses, you hopefully see his character start to re-emerge
Mhm.
as his personality starts to reassert itself against the magical process that he underwent in the first place before the story started. And I think part of that is, a lot of that is enabled by writing in the first person, which I don't usually do,
Mhm.
because I save that for when it makes the biggest impact. And I think it did in this story. I felt this had to be told from his perspective, and that would give you the insight into. To be honest, it was also the only way I felt I was going to get the ending.
Mhm.
Is the ambiguity of the ending, but also to get the effect of it, with him not knowing whether it was going to work or not, and his thought processes going into that. So again, it was that story all came out of character, um, and was approached from that perspective. Obviously, you've got to have a plot as well, but again, that was much more focused around the character of Damien.
Yeah, I think you definitely see that kind of gradual return as his personality comes back. There's a handful of suggestions in the story about what he was like prior to the events of the puzzle box. The fact that he was sort of into democratizing magic. He was trying to spread the knowledge and power to more people. Where did that come from, and how much did that play into the character in the story?
Yeah, where that specific aspect came from, I'm not entirely sure. I think it came from me wanting to write someone who was more of a good guy, but you know would not be seen as a good guy by everybody. So I suppose that was the thought process there, was saying, right, he has a great deal of power, but he wants to use that power to benefit others. However, how would that look to the people in power, like the guild? They would not see it that way. He would absolutely be a public enemy number one, and there would also be an inevitable uncertainty among everybody else about what he was actually doing, because you can't really do that sort of thing out in the open. Your motives are going to be suspect, even among the people for whom you may be trying to benefit. So yeah, I felt there was a lot of scope for ambiguity there, which is something that I do keep coming back to in stories.
I think Damien is I'm particularly fond of Damien, partially because I'm an Arcanist, and partially because of that aspect of his character where he is really a good guy, but he certainly doesn't seem like a good guy to the guild. But even other people that know him don't necessarily understand what he's doing, and I always found that really interesting when I originally read that story, and certainly now that we've gotten a little bit more about what he's up to now, it's a super interesting part of his whole backstory.
Mm-hmm. And I think as well, he may be trying to do something good, but I think there was aspects of his arrogance that came out in the story as well. I felt he was quite an arrogant person. He thought he could do that. I mean, it feels like something impossible, but he felt fairly confident he could pull it off. So I think that massive self-belief, if not arrogance, is a key part of his personality as well.
Yeah, definitely. That's I bet if he had told that plan to some other people before he pulled it off, they would have been like, "Don't even try." It's suicide.
That story also gave me the opportunity to get my friend into Malifaux fiction. Not into reading it, but actually inserted him into the story. So it's Marco Bonatti who's in that story.
Okay.
Is my friend Mark Bonatti.
Oh yeah,
Who actually
that's so funny.
does have Malifaux tattoos in real life.
Oh wow, and that's where the whole tattoo thing came from.
He is a real person, yes.
Wow, that's so funny. I assume he knows that he's in it, right?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
He was very delighted to see that he's also now a model. So
Yeah. It took over 10 years, but yeah, that's really funny. That actually leads right into my next question, and you sort of alluded to it earlier, but you know, reading lots and lots of Malifaux, or you made a joke about they kind of reference a lot of different things, and there's a lot of I guess inspiration you could call it. My take on a lot of the characters in Malifaux has always been that a lot of them have a clear inspiration, or they're based on a trope or a really well known kind of touch point, but they're then twisted, right? So it's maybe 20 to 40% this really well known trope, and then it's 60% weird. So I guess what's your take on that? And did you have, aside from Marco, for any of the other characters that you've written, did you have any specific inspirations that you kind of drew parts of their personality from, or was it more a mixture or totally original?
well, I mean, I suppose the most obvious example is Van Stoker in The Last Word.
It's a great example, yeah.
And I may have got the name of my own story there wrong. Was it The Final Word?
The final word, yeah,
It may have been The Final Word.
close enough.
But yeah, so I mean, he's a very obvious example of someone who's clearly made up of bits of other characters. But no, I mean, otherwise, in terms of inspiration, it's like everybody else. You have no idea what's inspiring you. It's the last 100 things you read, all sort of joining together in a mishmash inside your head, and some of it comes out and some of it doesn't. And that's certainly what drew me to Malifaux in the first place, was the really strong archetypal characters, but that they were the focus. They weren't just models. It wasn't just artwork. It was these individual characters were part of the game. Each model mostly had a name. That was a named person, and yeah, I thought it was really interesting. But I couldn't say any specific sort of real world inspiration examples for that. But one thing I did really like that Weird have done with it and they've done it more and much more as the company's gone on, as the sort of the representation they put into it. They have really made a concerted effort to to have really good representation, and not to objectify. There are some examples where they have in the past, but a lot of them where they haven't. And I think I really responded to that as well, and it's something I tried to pick up on in the fiction I was writing, not entirely successfully. We never succeeded at everything we try and do, but I did really. That part of the background really spoke to me, and I thought, right, that's something I can get on board with. They're really trying to do something for everyone here.
Yeah, so I think that's a very common thing for fans to discuss. It's certainly, I mean, the single thing that drew me to the game originally before I knew anything about the lore was just I looked at all the characters and I was like, wow, there's so many different, there's half of them are women and there's all these different people from different backgrounds. It's I think what draws a lot of people to the game. Was that something that was really front and center on your mind when you were writing the stories? I would guess, I can't say for sure, but I would guess now that that's something that Weird specifically goes after when they have new stories come out and new characters come out. They're trying specifically to diversify, but is that something that you were conscious of and specifically seeking to do when you were writing for them?
Yes, it was. I felt a responsibility when writing them to have each character be as rounded a character as I was capable of writing them, and to try and not objectify or misrepresent any character in there. Yeah, that was absolutely something I was thinking of. It began with the first Colette story. She's a showgirl, and there's an obvious angle you could go in describing her character, and I tried to avoid, I suppose, some of the obvious things you could do there, and really focus on who her and Cassandra were as characters, taking that into Molly as well, and sort of a little more successful, I think, there than I was with the Colette and Cassandra story. But um, I'm not sure about other writers, but I certainly feel that's with the other fiction. Just reading it, that that's an attitude that's shared.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to be fair, I feel like that's a harder ask when you're writing for Colette because of who she is, and what their background is. They're walking around in sexy clothes and all that kind of stuff. So it's certainly a bit more of a challenge when writing for her. But again, I think that story. I've had an idea for a video bouncing around in my head for since I started this channel to see which of the Malifaux rulebooks passed the Bechdel test. I don't know if you're familiar with the Bechdel test, but basically it's a
Yes.
test to see if the female characters are actually characters or not based on who they interact with and how, because most fiction, the female characters are just kind of objects for men to do things with or to. Um, and I'm guessing that even as far back as the first book, it passes. And I don't think it's going to be close. I think it's going to pass pretty early on and multiple times. So um, I think, and in book two, I'm guessing the Cassandra and Colette story would be one.
I'm pretty sure. I can't remember if the Cassandra and Colette story does, but I do remember thinking about the Bechdel test when I did a rewrite of the main book one story. So when they re-released that main story, I'd actually said to Weird, "Look, can I have a go at rewriting that?" There was just some things I wanted to sort of punch up in it. It's odd. The first thing that bothered me in reading that story was it was set in Malifaux. It was an entirely separate world. It's not part of Earth. This isn't. We don't even know where it is,
Mhm.
and we've no idea if the sky is the same color, how many suns or moons it has. That really bugged me. I thought we don't know what color the sky is,
There's two moons.
and it always really annoyed me for some reason. Um, and so I got an opportunity to go in and just put that sort of detail in, but also I was consciously thinking about the Bechdel test when I rewrote that first one. I thought, right, I'm going to put a scene in here that passes it
So
and just throw it
I
in.
actually had no idea that the story was actually changed. I've never owned the original rule book. But now I guess I have to go track that down and see what's changed and see what you did.
I didn't redo the whole story. It was really just going through, doing an edit, as it
Mm.
were. Added some dialogue, some scenes, changed a few things around, but nothing too serious. But I got the opportunity to get solve my pet peeve, which was what color is the sky?
Excellent. Well, I mean, it's that kind of little detail that kind of brings the world to life and gives us the opportunity to feel
That's
like
what I was
we were
thinking.
there if we want to, for sure. Um, so I mean, we kind of touched on a lot of different things there, but when you're writing, we talked about the kind of complicated plots and different character things. Is there something that you get the most gratification out of when you're writing, or something that you like to focus on the most, or in terms of like whether it's themes or kind of characterization or plot? Um, what's your favorite thing? What's the thing that you enjoy the most?
That's a good question.
This comes from one of my patrons. They wanted to know.
In the writing itself, when you're actually battering out words on a keyboard, you kind of once you're in the flow, that's fantastic. The words are just flying, the characters are there, they're yelling their next lines at you before you're
Mhm.
getting to them. You're just writing as fast as you can. It's a fantastic feeling. When a story's come together, you're right in the middle of it and all's going great. And then you realize you have no idea how you're going to get to the next scene. And then you realize actually the next scene idea you had doesn't work and you've got a problem. And the way I solved that every time was running and cycling. I don't know how many times I would be on a run and solve a story problem while I was running, because I don't know if it's just you get time to think about it. You're just running, or is it the extra oxygen? You're exercising, but I found so many times that I would just be turning the story over in my head. Something would happen, and I would just start writing it there and then as I ran. That was always a fantastic feeling when you crack some part of a story like that, and then you can't wait to get to a keyboard and write it down.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I wonder if it has like a meditative quality when you're just running. You have time to think enough.
Whatever works. Yeah, I think every writer has a different thing that works for them. When you
Yeah.
find something that seems to work reliably for you, it's wonderful.
We just launched a narrative league, myself and the Danger Plan, another competitive focus Malifaux YouTube channel, and I'm actually writing a fan fiction style story for the narrative league. It's the first time I've ever really written anything, so
Oh
I
yeah.
might have to pick your ear offline to get some tips, because it's I agree,
No problem.
there's certain times where you're writing something and you're just like, I don't know how to make this work, but I might have to try jogging. So another very common thing that we see in Malifaux stories, and this applies to yours as well as the rest, is that a lot of times things are left what seemingly intentionally ambiguous, right? We don't get very specific, clear answers to a lot of things. Is that something that you incorporate intentionally for the intrigue? Is that something where you just don't want to kind of tie yourself to certain answers? Is it something you were aware you were doing at all?
No, I do like ambiguity in a story. I do include it deliberately. Yeah, that's just a tick of mine. I think something I keep returning to. Um, I hope that I put enough clues in the body of the story so that nothing is actually impossible to work out, but I'm happy to leave certain things vague in there and just let the reader not do all the work, but have at least some work to do. Or, and this is the other use for it, is just leave room for their own imagination to say, "Oh right, we weren't told about that bit, but I can." That means I can fill that bit in myself. I can fill that motivation in myself, or I can fill in that backstory, or whatever it might be.
Okay. I always assumed that it was intentional, because it seems a lot of the things are left and it's like, well, I didn't get a clear answer here. And when I'm kind of, you know, telling the stories to other people in videos and whatnot, sometimes I say something is something, and then I go back and reread it and I'm like, but it may not be. I'm not 100% sure. So I need to hedge a little bit and say that it might not really be that. But on that note, I'm going to ask you a couple of specific questions about the stories you've written, and
Oh no.
if you can, I want you to answer at least what your intention was when you wrote it. Is that fair?
Okay.
All right. So in the Mountain Straight reply, English Ivan is ostensibly working for the Arcanists, the Union. He tells someone that he works for Lucius, and he also has some sort of shadowy master that he's working for that is not named, who I believe we later find out is the Explorer Society, who he's now aligned with. That book is also the first time we hear mention of the Explorer Society. So question is, was he just lying when he said he was working for Lucius? And did you know he was working for the Explorer Society, or was that something that was not decided at that time?
Okay. Yeah, he was lying. He wasn't working for Lucius.
I thought so.
I certainly envisaged him as, the classic spy in the sort of George Smiley brand of spy, who you're fairly sure you know who he's working for, but it's entirely possible there's bluffs within bluffs there, and he's very comfortable in that sort of territory. But no, I didn't know anything about the Explorers Society at that point. No, that hadn't been mentioned when we were writing that. But that is the benefit of leaving that sort of ambiguity in a story, as you leave room for other writers, later writers, to fill in the blanks. You throw away a mention of something in a story, and someone can just come back and flesh that out entirely. The Clockwork Maiden, you just throw that in with the alley that moves around Malifaux, and someone may return to that at a later date or may not. And I remember at one point I did have Nathan saying, right, tell me more about this alleyway. Who are these people you've mentioned? What are they like? And I said, Nathan, I have no idea who they are. But if you want me to tell you, I will tell you.
Sounds like a future story to me. So in Master of Fate, last scene we see Zoraida watching a girl through the window of her house. Is that her sister, Emily?
Yes.
Okay. I think that was pretty well suggested, but I just wanted to know for sure.
Yeah. So job done then. It was you were fairly sure what the answer was, but
Yeah.
I didn't sort of lead you down the garden path.
Yeah. There's enough going on in that story that to even understand exactly what happened, I probably had to read it 3 times. And then when I got to the end, I was like, okay, but I'm still not sure who this woman is. But it seemed pretty clear.
We see that's the benefit of a story with a twist at the end and a bit of ambiguity is you get 2 stories out of it because you get the first time you read it and then the second time you read it.
Absolutely, 100%, yes. And then in Puzzle Box, we find out that Thorpe, the Witchling handler, leaves with Damien at the end. But why? Is that something that you thought about or that you considered? Because as far as I know, there's not even really a suggestion there, except that they developed a relationship. And
Yeah. So there's history there between the two of them before he becomes a stalker.
okay,
So obviously there's history there. She hunted him, and she says that she hunted him in the past. But she'd never really gone after him because I think she recognised that he wasn't a peril, he wasn't a danger. But then he did something that she mentions. He did something that put him on my radar, and she hunted him down and caught him. And then, of course, she's his handler. And then I think in the last scene you see her, she's got her hunter's makeup back on. So my thinking there was she knows he's leaving. She doesn't know why he was there in the first place, but she knows that she didn't catch him. He allowed himself to be caught. The hunt is not over. And so that's her recognising that the hunt isn't over. It's about to start again, and I'll be waiting for you. Quite what the relationship is after that, I don't know.
Okay, awesome. I think that yeah, I think she knew a little bit more than what certainly what everybody else knew, so that makes sense. For the final word, I don't think there was anything that was super unclear, except I find it very difficult to explain to people in any kind of concise way what the Library of All Things is. I think I understand it, but I find it very difficult to explain to people. So I would love it if you could explain to everyone else what the Library of All Things is and how it works.
Right, okay. It comes from an idea from George Louis Borges, the writer. I was reading some of his work at the time. Fantastic writer, well worth reading. But the idea of the library, break it down. is it exists there. I think that in my head, it's always been there, and it predates essentially every culture and civilization in Malifaux.
Mhm.
And as a culture civilization develops, its core stories, if you like, its narrative texts that define it as a society, appear effectively in the library. They are not entering. They don't go and put them in there themselves, but the library puts them there itself, and that library then, in turn, there's a sort of feedback effect of once your stories are in the library, then the library reinforces the existence of your culture within Malifaux, which is why presumably there's a gremlin section in there as well. And
It's all about
the
moonshine.
deeper you delve in the library, there's something of everything in there. And so that was my idea about the Ten Thunders. Was over time their core works would accumulate in the library. Effectively their culture would slowly accumulate in the library, and therefore Malifaux would slowly change to reflect their presence within it. But as is the Ten Thunders, they're not willing to wait for that process at all. They find out about it and they think, fantastic, if we just put all our stuff in the library, we short circuit the process, we get the benefit of the feedback effect, and we become very powerful very quickly. Which, if you're being introduced as a faction by the makers of the game, is what happens. So I felt I was reflecting a sort of almost a game mechanic in that sense. But yeah, I think if you were in the library, yeah, you could find texts from the Gremlins, from the Neverborn, from everything that exists in Malifaux.
Yeah, I think it's sort of this physical manifestation of culture that is sort of
Yes.
fed into by the people that live in Malifaux, and then also it feeds back into them. And I love that idea that it kind of works both ways, and that it's a to an extent it's kind of a mixture of all of the different cultures that are there. Because obviously, not only are there lots of human cultures there, but there's all non-human cultures and all these different things. So I like it. I had never considered that it is also a reflection of game mechanics because I wasn't playing in first edition to see the Ten Thunders suddenly appear. But that's actually a really interesting point. I hadn't considered that.
And the stuff about every piece of the library is the library.
Mm.
Doesn't really have anything to do with that. I just thought it was a really cool detail that if you just tear a piece of the page off it and keep reading that page, eventually you get to read the entire library. And just felt like a cool idea.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think they reference that bit in the new story that deals with the library of all things, but I also like that bit of it because that tied into the story of the final word where somebody finds something and they read and it keeps changing the text.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And then a story that we didn't really talk much about, but I know at least a few people on my Discord that this is one of their favorite stories, The Great Adventure, where we see Teddy go on a rampage and all sorts of things happen. I don't really have a mystery question to ask you here, but at the very end, huge spoiler alert, Zephyr gets stabbed. And I know a lot of people really like that character, so I want to know if Zephyr died or not. So just say no, and then we can get a new story with Zephyr.
I mean, after that story was written, I then the Desperate Mercenary model came out, and I painted my finest model I've ever painted was a Desperate Mercenary. My painting has gone downhill since then. So that was the peak of my painting ability. So she can't possibly have died if I was able to paint such a good miniature.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear.
The end of that story was actually a real problem. I knew what was going to happen, but I'd written it and it was completely flat. And I'd even submitted the story to Weird, and it just bothered me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then eventually I emailed Weird and said, "Have you sent that to the printer or whatever? If I get time?" And they said, "No, you can do whatever you want." And so I rewrote the ending, and I'm so glad I did because it just the previous one fell so flat. Whereas in the revised ending, well, I suppose in the original version, you didn't have any of Teddy's celebration at the end. He was just a sad Teddy. and that just didn't work. And it was only after I'd written it, and a couple of weeks later, I realised, no, he needs to be a happy Teddy at the end of it. That's who he is. That's what's tragic.
Yeah, no, I think I really enjoy that story because you get the two perspectives. You get this perspective of the horrible things Teddy's doing, and then you get Teddy's perspective of we're just playing a game. And I think that story sticks with a lot of people because of that. But in particular, I think Zephyr was a interesting character because of, again, all the kind of mystery and the little bits of intrigue that you worked in there. So it's
I
something that.
really, oh, sorry, just say I really enjoyed writing that story, the whole process of putting that together. And Zephyr was a fantastic character. Would like to revisit that character again at some point if possible, if she hadn't sadly died at the end.
Do you still have that model? Can you send me a picture of it so I can show everyone?
I still have the model. Yes, I can send you. I send you a photo of it. No problem. I sold loads of Malifaux models, but I kept that one.
Awesome. Yeah, I would. That'd be really cool. Zephyr definitely didn't die. Confirmed. She's coming back. She'll be seen again.
Yeah, that story was just an example of sort of throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, into stories. There's the wee Malkies in that story, and the wee street kids. Yeah, those are from an old poem from a Glasgow poet called the Wee Malkies. And so I just love throwing little details like that in, and you never know who's going to pick up on them. But it's part of the fun of, when you get time to write the story and then you can go back over it and just start adding layers and bits of depth and little Easter eggs here and there.
Yeah, I'm
Really good
not
fun.
100% sure about this, but I think they've shown up in other stories since then. I think it might be in one of the RPG books where they talk about bad things that happen in the slums and referring to gangs and stuff like that. But I think they're still around.
Good.
Yeah. Well, I do want to be respectful of your time. I could sit here and talk to you about this stuff for many, many, many more hours, but just a couple of last couple of questions here to wrap up.
Sure.
Um, I know you haven't been writing for Weird for a couple years now. I think probably Masters of Fate was the most recent story you wrote. Is that right? Does that sound right? Early second edition.
Yes, that's right. I think the last thing I wrote for them was 2015, 2016. So yeah, it's been quite a while. Although oddly
If
enough, I did go back and they did ask me to write, and I said I would, and then I emailed them a few weeks later and said, guys, it's not going to happen. I was just too busy with my sort of real life job at that point, work and family. And I also said to them, and to be honest, it was true at that point, which was being paid to write was becoming like a job, something I was doing for fun. I now felt every time I agreed to write a story, then there was a deadline, then there was pressure, and I thought, I'm not enjoying this anymore. So after I'd finished writing for them and I said, thanks so much, guys, but I'm done now. I think it was about a year or two later, I just wrote a story and stuck it up on the forum. But I just wrote it for fun, and it was a Colette story. And again, it's probably still up there, but Colette and Molly, my two favourite characters in the whole of Malifaux.
Very good choices. Well, I guess that might answer the question I was going to ask, which is if you could write the next chapter for any character in the fiction, who would it be? You got to pick Colette or Molly.
Yeah, I would probably go with Colette. Graham Stevenson writes Molly. He wrote some excellent Molly stories, including the one where she teams up with
Karai.
who's the Razor? Who's the other Razor?
Karai.
Karai, yes,
Yeah.
of course. That's right. My tongue. He wrote that story where Molly teams up with Karai, and I
Yeah, the
think
Grey
that's a
Lord. I love
real
that
favourite.
story.
That one. And Graham Stevenson's also a very funny writer. So he's definitely got the any next chapters for Molly, but I would happily write another Colette story, I think.
Okay, good to know. Do you still? I mean, you mentioned that you've put some stuff up on the forums. Do you still do any other writing, whether it's for Weird or otherwise, or is it mostly just a regular job now?
No, I'm afraid not. Yeah, it's haven't done any writing for years now, but just had my nose to the grindstone work-wise and family-wise. So yeah, may get back to it someday, but it's not going to be this year, I don't think.
Oh, I certainly hope you'll get back into it at some point. We'd love to get some more stories from you there. I certainly enjoy
Oh,
the
thank
ones
you.
that you've put out, and like I said, I know a ton of people in the community. When Ivan came out, people were freaking out. They loved that character. They were so happy to see him become a master. Same for Damien, and a bunch of these other stories that we talked about are some of the fan favorites for sure. So,
That's very nice to hear.
is there anywhere are you on any kind of social media anywhere that folks can keep up with you, or do you kind of keep your private life to yourself now?
No, no, I don't do sort of Twitter or anything else like that. No, I'm afraid not.
Well, I guess folks can they'll find you on the weird forums and maybe on Discord. Hopefully in the future to keep up with you if they want.
Yes, I've joined your Discord, so yep, you can find me there.
Are we going to tell people who you are because they're going to bug you?
Yes, so Dave 3000. And do I need to give the number as well? Is that part of it? You
No,
can tell I don't know Discord very
yeah.
well, don't
No, that's fine. I just didn't know if you wanted to lurk and be anonymous or if you were okay with everybody knowing who you are. Um, but yeah, so I guess if you
No,
have
it's
more
good.
questions for Dave, you can hop into the Discord and ping him on there. But I want to thank you so much for your
Yeah,
time. This was
definitely.
a blast, and it was really great to catch
Happy
up
to
with you.
chat.
Special thanks to the extremely cool kids tier over on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatize, and Biclops Gladiator Games. Thanks for watching.